I'm Daniel Stageman. I'm the research director here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So my remit for the next 3 minutes or so is to frame the college's institutional intentions in hosting and sponsoring a forum on this topic. For all that those intentions need to reflect the objective and evidence-based ethic required of a publicly funded university, there's no way to avoid the political realities that have brought us together today. It's right there in the title. We now investigate, advocate, research, and write on behalf of vulnerable individuals and communities who are made more vulnerable by the official hostility of the federal institutions charged with protecting them and promoting their well-being. The current administration is not the first to set policy and engage in practices that put individual immigrants and their communities at greater risk of criminal exploitation, but it may be the first to do so as part of a comprehensive, ideologically driven anti-immigrant strategy that defines its core political identity. If this then is our starting point, where should we expect today's talks and conversations to take us? Immigration, authorized, documented, or otherwise, will not stop because of anti-immigrant policy or sentiment. The risks that individuals will face to escape privation or violence, especially for their children, are effectively incalculable from the relative comfort of this room. This is a lot to talk about. Today's news and the world will still be there when we walk out these doors. The value of the day depends on our collective dedication to keeping our focus. We ask you, as participants, to help us do that, so that we can send you home with information and tools to help you better serve the communities that we work with. Finally, I'm delighted to announce today's event as the launch of John Jay's new Exploitation and Resiliency project. It's my great honor to introduce that project's director and principal investigator, Dr. Meredith Dank. Meredith?
I'm short. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Well, I'm very excited that all of you are here to listen to, as Dan said, was going to be, I think, a very powerful day of talks and panels. A little bit about the Exploitation and Resiliency Project, which was indeed today as our launch. First, I want to point out Andrea Hughes, who just literally walked back into the room, who is my colleague, who is also working on this project with me. The Exploitation and Resiliency Project focuses on documenting and elevating the voices of exploited and vulnerable, while also highlighting their resiliency and perseverance through rigorous empirical-based research. We have a number of different studies that we currently have going on, primarily focused on human trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking, but beyond that, we're looking at all types of violence against women and other types of victimization issues. The impetus for today's forum basically started when earlier this year, Sarah Stillman published her piece, When Deportation is a Death Sentence, in The New Yorker, which was published on January 15th, 2018. If you have not read it yet, I would highly encourage that you go and do so after the forum. I'm sure Sarah is going to be covering some of that, in addition to some of the work that she's been working on since that piece has been published. We're really excited to have her, and we're also excited to have 3 panels throughout the rest of the day. I'm hoping that the majority of you can stay, because each panel, I think, is going to provide a different and necessary perspective on the issue, particularly around what immigrants are facing in this country under the current administration, and how that might make them more vulnerable to human trafficking. But you're not here to hear me talk, so I'm just going to do a quick introduction of Sarah and then turn it over to her. Sarah Stillman is a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine, where she covers immigration, criminal justice, and other social policy issues. She also directs the Global Migration Project at Columbia Journalism School, where she runs team investigations into immigration and refugee issues. In her recent New Yorker expose, No Refuge, she documented the cases of dozens of asylum seekers who were deported by US authorities. With her Columbia team, she built a database of more than 60 cases of deportations to harm, and she's now assembling a parallel database in the refugee context. Sarah Stillman is a MacArthur Fellow as well. So without further ado, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dan and Meredith, for organizing this. And thank you all of you for being here to talk about this topic. I know it's a grim one, and I know we are ostensibly here to talk about Trump and the very grim realities of human trafficking in the current era of immigration enforcement, but I actually want to start by taking you very far away from that. Just for a moment, I want you to take a deep breath and I want to give your brain a little vacation from the Trump era for a quick moment. It's not too huge a mental vacation because I actually want to take you back to the Iraq War. And I want to take you to one of the very first stories that I ever told for The New Yorker, which happened to be a story about human trafficking, about gender-based vulnerabilities, and about labor migration. And there are several reasons that I want to start here. But one is that as singular as I think this moment can feel, and as urgent as it can feel, I think it's also incredibly critical to remember, as many of you in this room know because you've been fighting these fights for a very long time, that these crises around trafficking did not start with Trump, and they will surely outlast Trump and our current political moment. It's much bigger than one single president or one single administration's approach to enforcement issues. And the second reason that I want to start with my experience in Iraq is that it really shaped the heuristic that I've come to bring to really my entire journalistic career, covering vulnerable communities, and particularly immigrant communities. And I think, and I hope that it is a heuristic that might be helpful to some of you who are working in the realm of direct service provision, in the realm of legal aid services. I know we've got a really diverse group of folks in the room, so I hope that this proves to be a useful, really a useful way of seeing and thinking about how to tell these stories. So I was actually a freshman in college when the Iraq War began, and I knew at the time that I wanted to be a journalist, but I really had no idea what I was doing, or I felt like I didn't speak Arabic, didn't have a deep rooting in the culture and politics of the war that I wanted to cover. But I did have one thing, which is that I came from a family of labor rights advocates. And so I was always trained to look to the margins of stories other people were telling and ask what was happening to low-wage workers in those contexts. And so one day, I saw on the news that there was a group of Nepalese workers who believed that they were on their way to luxury hotels in Amman to work as cooks and cleaners. And it turns out that their bus was actually, they were on their way into Iraq, and they literally had no idea that they were going into Iraq. They really thought they were going to luxury hotels. This bus was hijacked by Sunni insurgents, and these workers were, 11 of them were shot, and one of them was beheaded. It turns out where these workers were actually bound was for US military bases in Iraq to provide services for US taxpayer-funded subcontractors of the government. And I thought it was curious that I had never really heard about this population. I started searching around and found that there were more than 70,000 of these workers that the US government had shipped in to do almost all of the difficult, crappy, and dangerous jobs on US bases. You can see one of them here. They were known as TCNs. That's always a little warning flag for me when a population is reduced to a little acronym. But I started to think about how I might try to learn more about the stories of these workers. And so it turns out they come from India, Nepal, Fiji, Uganda, Sierra Leone, many of the world's poorest countries. And I decided to fly off to Iraq and see what I could learn about their stories and whether this trafficking issue was more widespread. And one of the very first things I saw, actually I think the first thing I saw when I landed on the largest US military base in Baghdad, does anyone want to guess what it was? I hope you can tell from the picture. This is my visual aid of baby me. Anyone know? Cinnabon. So Cinnabon was the very first thing I saw. The second thing I saw, want to take a guess from this visual aid? I saw a beauty salon. The beauty salon was staffed by a bunch of Fijian workers. The Cinnabon was staffed by Indians and Nepalese workers who I soon found out had been promised nice jobs elsewhere in the Middle East and had paid massive recruiting fees and had gotten into deep debt to get these jobs and had wound up instead in Iraq. And I quickly learned one of the lessons that many of you who work with trafficking survivors know, which is that it takes a lot of patience to find ways to tell these stories. I started approaching workers. I very naively started doing so in front of their bosses. And every time I got the same reply, which is, "Madam, everything is going great. I'm really lucky to be here. I'm really grateful to the US government. Thank you so much." I would return to the same places, and finally I started realizing I had to approach people in safe venues, and sometimes that meant finding them while they were smoking in a bunker, or sometimes, as creepy as this sounds, I would try to find people, women in the ladies' bathroom, some of the Fijian beauticians who were working in this salon giving manicures and pedicures for soldiers. I first started chatting with them in the bathroom, and I quickly learned that they had actually been told they were going to get these very lavish jobs paying 10,000 US dollars a month in Dubai, and instead they had been brought to Iraq to do these manicures and pedicures for soldiers for 350 bucks a month, working 7 days a week. I went to visit this woman, Vinnie, in her CHU, it was called, a containerized housing unit where she lived, and one night, I knocked on the door, and she answered, and she was crying. And her colleague next to her, Lydia, was also crying. And I asked what was happening, and they said that their boss had just sexually assaulted Lydia. And all across the base, and this is, I think, a big parable for so many enforcement efforts, everywhere across the base there were these posters saying, the US military is committed to stopping sexual assault on our bases, call this hotline number. I called the hotline number, and decided that even though I'm a journalist in this context, it's my responsibility to find out, at the very least, what are these women's options for getting help in this context. And I called the emergency hotline and heard it ring, and heard it ring, and heard it ring, and no one picked up. I called the next day, and it rang, and rang, and rang, and no one picked up. I called one more time, and finally I got through to someone at the emergency hotline, and they told me that because these women were not assaulted by a US service member, and because they were not themselves US service members, that there was nothing they could do. I had to call the company. I called the company, and they told me they don't deal with, quote, touchy-feely issues. I needed to call the military. What this story was about for me is really the topic that I want to touch on today, which is this notion of these legal black holes of protection, legal black holes of enforcement, legal black holes of rule of law. That's really where these Fijian women and the 70,000 TCNs we brought to Iraq and Afghanistan found themselves, and I think it's where we find ourselves now. Not just these black holes of enforcement and rule of law, but also these black holes of public empathy, these black holes of public consciousness and of public discourse. So I want to talk in part today about how we create a language that makes visible some of the fights that many of you are fighting really on the front lines, and in particular how we make our language about trafficking as capacious as possible to incorporate the many, many ways it unfolds. One of the things that I learned from Vinnie is that she actually finally got home from Iraq, gets back to Fiji. Litigators in the US decide they want to try to bring a lawsuit on her behalf. So they fly her to the US, and she gets to meet with people from the State Department. I was allowed to come along in these meetings. Vinnie tells her story to the State Department representatives. She tells the saga of how she'd paid these massive recruiting fees, how she'd been taken to a country she hadn't agreed to go to. And the State Department official looks back at her and says, I'm really sorry, that's awful, but unfortunately that doesn't constitute human trafficking. She reads through her sense of the regulations. She says your passport wasn't confiscated. You technically had a moment when you could have turned back. She had a moment in Dubai when she was given the option, do you want to proceed? At that point, she'd given her life savings. Her children were depending on this income, and she'd given it all away to the person that I would argue is the trafficker in this context. But our language and our vision of how these laws applied simply did not incorporate the story of someone like Vinnie, or the story of really tens of thousands of people who were brought into that war zone. And I think that that's very true for many of the stories that people in this room are working on. They sometimes don't fit within the legalese. And I think it was also true of the attempt to bring a lawsuit on these workers' behalf. I think another reason this story feels a pertinent place to start talking about the Trump era is that so many of the stories that we're working on are often utterly ubiquitous in certain senses, and yet we are not trained, the public is not trained to see them. So the reason I often tell this story to journalism school students, in that context, it's really about how do you learn to train your eyes towards the margin of the story everyone else is trying to tell, and to attune yourself to the bodies and the subplots that other people aren't noticing. I think the good news about being in this particular room is that all of you are already noticing this story. So I would imagine, not only are you noticing it, but you're, I have to assume, pretty deep in the trenches of it right now. So I thought what might be more helpful today is to really think about how we can actually transport that attunement into a language that reaches the broader public, because that's what I try to do as a journalist, and I know we've got some brilliant journalists in the room who try to do the same. And the last reason I bring this story up is that I think it gets to one of the topics I know we're hitting on in some of the panel sessions today, which is that I think one of the reasons these stories often are not visible is because we are so attuned to telling a trafficking story that is singularly about sex trafficking. I think a lot of the journalists who went to Iraq, first of all, they went there searching for the Bang Bang story, and that was everywhere. These workers were everywhere. You could not be on a US military base and not see them cooking and cleaning and being everywhere in your line of sight. But I think because so many of us have been trained to conceptualize trafficking as something that happens only in the sex trafficking context, labor trafficking is so often invisibilized. So I'm really pleased that we have, I believe it's Dara, Darlene is going to be doing the panel, and a number of you as experts are going to be on the panel that's about labor trafficking. And she's one of the journalists I respect most covering these issues. So I'm really glad to be here today to listen and learn from that as well. And to talk about just how we might make the conversation on trafficking a little bit more honest and nuanced about the ways it's interwoven with our national fabric. So what I want to do now is enumerate 5 of the really specific ways in which I've seen some of the Trump-era approaches to immigration enforcement and render families, and particularly, I would argue, women, more vulnerable to human trafficking at this particular moment in time, and often through mechanisms that, again, I think are left out of much of the public discourse around immigration rights and immigration enforcement. I think these are subplots, the ones I'm about to enumerate are ones that I've been trying to look at in my own reporting, and I think are often the less sexy, more bureaucratic stories that could get a little bit lost in the weeds. So I'm going to try to tell them through the stories of actual individuals. But I want to start, and then I will, I promise I will try to end also on a hopeful note and just talk about a few of the tools and strategies I try to use as a journalist in bringing these stories to light and making them intelligible to folks who may not inherently think that they care about them, and things that I think may be helpful to those of you working in a direct service or advocacy context. First, I'm going to pause and ask, can all of you hear me in the back there? Okay, fantastic. So I want to transition to these 5. And the first is, I think, really one of the most undertold stories when it comes to the intersections of immigration enforcement and human trafficking. And that is this issue of what we call border security, what some would call border militarization. And I think we have been sold a rhetoric. I mean, many of you will remember President Trump's very first announcement about why he wanted to run for president, and the story that we heard about the dangers immigration poses to us and the need to, I think it was those 3 words, build a wall. Build a wall really constituted this president's initial platform. But it's not exclusive to this president. I think it's really important to acknowledge that essentially in the post-9/11 landscape, we've seen a real transformation in how we think about border security. We have not seen comprehensive immigration reform, but what we've seen is sending billions more to border enforcement than to any to border enforcement and immigration enforcement than to any other law enforcement agency, all of those funds combined. And I would argue that one of the things that we've started to see at the border over the last several decades is the massive empowerment of organized crime. Once upon a time, I think we saw these mom and pop shop smugglers who were essentially bringing people across the border for a fee, and we all know that that would constitute smuggling and not trafficking. One of the things I think we've seen, and I have a quote here from Michelle Brenet from the Women's Refugee Commission, who I've interviewed about this phenomenon. She said that she increasingly sees this complicated blurring of the lines between trafficking and smuggling, because as we approached the border through a means that was about enforcement as deterrence, so a means that was really about trying to make it as hard as possible to cross, what we also saw is that the border became not only more lethal, but also more lucrative for smugglers to take control of. And what we saw is that there has been a real transition from smugglers to traffickers and cartels like the Zetas, who know that this is an immensely profitable realm in which to be working now. And so I interviewed Terry Goddard, also the former Arizona Attorney General, and he was the mayor in Phoenix as well. And he said that the phenomenon that they have seen is in some ways akin to prohibition. The harder and harder and harder we've worked to clamp down those migration patterns, the more we have seen organized crime enter the picture as the people that was being smuggled have to rely upon to get across. I cannot tell you the number of individuals who I've interviewed either directly at the border or soon after their migration who have been held by cartels. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned from some of that reporting. So I got a call. This was actually before President Trump came into office, from a really brilliant friend who's an anthropologist, Amelia Frank Vitale, who was working in a migrant shelter in southern Mexico. And Amelia called me to say that there was this bus organizing of Central American mothers who were on their way to try to find their missing loved ones who had disappeared while trying to get to the United States. I thought this was going to be more of a symbolic protest, and I said I'd love to come along. It turned out to be a very literal 3,000-mile trek where these women were trying to find their missing husbands or their missing daughters or their missing sons by literally going to morgues, hospitals, prisons, standing, as you can see, as Anna is doing there with her son Oscar. Anna would stand in the town square and she would have the picture of her son and she would say, "Has anyone seen my son?" In every single town we went to more than 20 different towns across Mexico, starting at the southern border and then migrating all the way up to the north to Tamaulipas and Reynosa and then all the way back down. And it was really interesting to me as I went on this journey, not only did I learn about many of the root causes that their loved ones had, that had caused their loved ones to flee towards the United States to begin with, things like the takeover of gangs in the Northern Triangle countries, so particularly El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. But I also learned about the tremendous journeys they were facing along the way. We were sleeping in these migrant shelters at each stop along the route, and we would often be sleeping on the floor alongside unaccompanied minors who were making this journey by themselves, fleeing gangs. One of the #1 stories that I was hearing from these women is that they were getting ransom calls from people who were claiming to have their loved ones in their possession and saying, "If you don't pay me $3,000, I'm going to kill your loved one." Oftentimes, as with some of the women in this particular picture, they did pay the ransom fee and the loved ones were not released. These people may have never even been in possession of them in the first place. Many of you may be familiar with this phenomenon in Mexico, and particularly along the journey. I had never really thought about this as an American story until I started listening to these women's voices and hearing, #1, that the traffickers and those people who are the extortionists are 100% reliant on these ransom fees from people who are living in America, many of whom are working alongside you. I've talked to women who work at Chipotle here in New York City who have gotten these ransom calls about loved ones making the migration route. But I also learned that it's an American story in a very different sense, which is that it's not only happening in Mexico on the Mexico side, but there's also a tremendous targeting of undocumented families who are known to be vulnerable, who are known to fear turning to law enforcement for help, actually on the US side of the border. So I want to tell you briefly about this family, the Godoys. You can see them there, Brian and Robinson. So when they were little, their parents came to Trenton, New Jersey, and did so unauthorized. They wanted to essentially try to make a nest egg for the kids. Their plan all along was to return to Guatemala. But things started getting more and more dangerous in their town, where they were from. And ultimately, they also had a US citizen child and weren't sure what to do when the boys back in Guatemala started to face extortionists in their hometown. And one of the boys saw another kid from his school murdered on the soccer field. As the threats increased in their town, finally the parents decided, look, we know this is really dangerous, but we are going to pay a smuggler, and we're going to bring the kids north to New Jersey to join us. And what wound up happening to them is they made it through the journey I just described, which has now become so immensely dangerous, all the threats both on the train itself, all the threats from the Mexican government who were giving a huge amount of money to essentially clamp down on migration, who are actually often directly involved in the trafficking networks there. They made it through all of that. They get across the border to Texas. A car pulls up to them and says that the parents have sent him to pick them up. They get in the car, and it turns out this is actually just a rogue opportunist, someone who has figured out that undocumented families in immigration enforcement environments of incredible fear are very, very vulnerable to extortion. So they tell the family that if they don't pay, I believe it was something like $3,000, that the boys could potentially be hurt or even killed. And so the family finds a way to actually, first they find a way to put together the money, but one of the things I really want to underscore about this context is it's an environment where law enforcement had done a really tremendous job of cultivating a huge amount of trust with the local community. They had made it very clear that they were not an immigration enforcement area where police, local law enforcement would be potentially turning people over for deportation. And you can imagine this was a real concern for the Godoys, themselves being undocumented. And their pastor, who's in this picture here, told them, I think we can trust the police here, and let's go to them. They did that, and they actually got tremendous help from Homeland Security investigations, who did a really good job in this case of helping to rescue the boys and helping to get them back to their parents. So I think that was an environment where you saw those collaborations happening in an effective way, where there was trust with the community and where the family felt that they could turn there for help. So one of the things that has really been on my mind lately is, what would this story look like if it unfolded today? What happened for these boys is that they came to Trenton. The Trenton Police Department decided to help the boys try to procure a U visa. As all of you will know, I believe we have a panel on U visas, right? T visas and U visas. So the line is very, very long, but nonetheless, law enforcement helped certify the visas, and they're still in the waiting process, but they're kind of on their way and doing really, really well in Trenton at the moment. But you may know that there are also probably 5 or 6 different reasons. We could probably spend the rest of the time talking about this particular slide, reasons why this family might have had a different outcome today. One of those reasons is that under Trump-era policy, there have been clear calls for the direct criminalization and apprehension of parents like the Godoys who have paid a smuggler, who in this context is sometimes referred to, I would argue wrongly, as a trafficker, to bring the kids to meet them in New Jersey. And there are direct calls for the parents in such circumstances when an unaccompanied minor is being returned to the parent to have that parent apprehended and placed in removal proceedings. The family themselves, they could also face deportation given, the most obvious and most enormous shift that we've seen was directly with the executive order right when Trump first came into office, with the major shift in enforcement priorities. So the Godoys would ostensibly under Obama have been a very low priority family. The parents have at this point been in the US for, I believe it's more than 20 years now. And none of them have any criminal record or anything to speak of in that regard. But today, a minor traffic violation could result in their deportation, and I think they would have a very legitimate reason to be concerned. You can also imagine how this story might have unfolded in some other states. Right now, we've seen a big push, not just at the federal level, but also at some state levels, to see a really muscular collaboration between local immigration enforcement and federal immigration enforcement and local police towards the end of orchestrating deportations. So many of you may be familiar, for instance, in Texas with SB 4, which is essentially essentially a punitive measure against what are known as sanctuary counties or cities, and mandating that law enforcement be able to ask about someone's immigration status. I'm going to get to how that can potentially be lethal down the road, and this is the family actually all together now at church. So I want to transition to one of the projects that I've been working on lately that's really tied to this. I've already hit on a few of these points. Those of you who do direct work already know many of these things very well, but one of the things that we've seen quite clearly is this chilling effect on reporting a whole range of offenses in an environment of incredible anxiety and fear. So when Trump first came into office in those first several months, the LA police chief, Charlie Beck, put forth some statistics. He said that he had seen a 25% drop in the Latino neighborhoods of LA in sexual assault reporting rates. He'd seen also a precipitous drop in reporting of domestic violence. And we saw a similar thing in Houston, a 43% drop in sexual assault reporting in the first 3 months of the Trump administration. So I decided with my team at Columbia, which is called the Global Migration Project, to embark on a more robust public records search around these issues to see how it was playing out in different areas. I think the first thing I'll note is that it was actually pretty tough to do because it turns out these results are not uniform. These issues are playing out in such dramatically different ways in different localities, really differently in rural environments, for instance, where there are very few legal service providers, versus a place like New York City, where there are so many of you working to provide, for instance, T visas and U visas to folks, and to provide safe environments where people might report crimes. And one of the things that we found was a pretty similar decline also in the rates of victims of gender-based violence or domestic violence seeking protective orders. So for instance, in Colorado, one of the district attorneys told us that they had seen literally 0 requests for protective orders in some of the early months of the Trump administration. There had basically just been an entire silencing of women who felt that they could no longer come forward against their abusers. Many of you will be familiar with some of the stories I didn't put on the slide of people who were arrested directly at courthouses when they had gone to report domestic violence. I've heard many, many stories from survivors about abusers who essentially leveraged women's undocumented status against them to continue abusing them. I literally did an interview with my team with a woman who said that her boyfriend was trying to kill her. She hid in the bathroom. And the main thing her partner was screaming at her was, "Don't you know who's president now?" Wielding that as like an excuse for abusing her and reminding her of what could happen to her if she tried to come forward. And so I think stats are still emerging on what this looks like in the T visa and U visa context, so I'll love to learn from your panel on that. But I think another thing I've heard directly on the ground is shifts in some of the places where law enforcement certifications are even harder to get now. So it's just so variable depending on the circumstances of geography. And then many of you may be familiar with the USCIS memorandum regarding what happens to people who do attempt to seek certain forms of legal relief, particularly T visas and U visas. Those people can now be placed directly into the deportation pipeline if those visas don't come through. So now there's also a really clear and tangible risk of even attempting to seek some kind of protection. I already mentioned that ICE has also been seen at outside of courthouses. I should add, though, that one of the things many of you may remember we saw directly here in New York is the presence of ICE outside the Queens Human Trafficking Intervention Courthouse. Oops. So one of the very first things that my team and I endeavored to do, we called it the Trump Tracker. I just made a simple weekly assignment for my students. I said, every week we're going to divide up the country, and we're really going to try to get a feel at the very, very granular level for what Trump-era immigration enforcement looks like. And so we just divided states, we divided themes, and every week they funneled information into this spreadsheet. Because I will admit, I was actually a little skeptical at the beginning of this administration about whether what we were seeing was really a big empirical shift on the ground, or whether what we were seeing was actually just a massive shift in rhetoric. And obviously, we know that there's a dialogical relationship between those two things, but I think it's important to distinguish and to really try to eke out what do these enforcement strategies really look like at the granular level, not just at the level of rhetoric. And then I think one of the things that that project yielded is really helping us realize exactly how tangible fear really is. Statistics about what happens after an immigration enforcement raid in terms of children not showing up at school, what happens, I can just walk you through a few of the things that we found in the Trump Tracker. So I don't know if you can actually read this, but one of the things that we found here, probably the biggest theme, and this will not surprise many of you, but this goes back to the executive order and the shift of immigration enforcement priorities. One of the big things we saw is like the massive rounding up of people of mothers in particular, who had no prior criminal convictions and who didn't fit the former administration's enforcement profiles. So, one very simple case study that I've been following for the last year involves a woman named Adalia Fuentes. I think I may have even have a picture of her. Yep. So this is Adalia, and I think her family is very emblematic of many of how these enforcement issues are playing out for a lot of reasons. But Adalia came here from Honduras, I believe almost 20 years ago. She has U.S. citizen children, a mixed status family, one DACA recipient. Her husband in the Obama era was driving to work one day. He got pulled over. He was found to be undocumented. He was essentially given prosecutorial discretion and had regular ICE check-ins, but was not deported. A very similar thing happened to Adalia. I did not actually mention this in the story we wound up writing, The Mothers Deported under the Trump administration, but one of the things that really stood out to me about Adalia's case was that she was working at a hotel. She was cleaning. She complained about the cleaning chemicals that were being used and that they were causing her problems. And she complained about wage theft, which a lot of the undocumented women at this particular hotel said they were also experiencing. And pretty soon thereafter, she believes, and I don't have any definitive proof of this, I've contacted the police department and they explicitly deny this, but she believes that her employer may have turned her over to immigration enforcement, because what happened to Adalia, she was driving to work one morning, it was 5 in the morning, she was obeying all the traffic laws, She was pulled over on what appears to have been a pretextual traffic stop about some minor thing with her, the back of her car, and she was really quickly turned over to federal immigration enforcement authorities who placed an ICE hold on her while she was at the jail because she couldn't afford to pay bail because she didn't have it on her, and she was then swiftly deported to Honduras. So as we think about the interplay between all these different variables, I will say that one thing I've noticed is the number of women who are being deported to incredibly vulnerable situations where trafficking may be a potential threat. A lot of these women are going back to areas, as Adalia is, where she's now a woman living by herself. The dad is living here. He's going to regular ICE check-ins. He doesn't know what his fate will be, but they have U.S. citizen children who are deeply rooted in the U.S. I don't want to go on too long about all the different things we found in the tracker, so I'm going to skip ahead. So as I mentioned, one of the findings in the tracker was all these women who were getting removed without any prior criminal convictions. But I want to turn now to this question I think we often leave out. What about the people who do have criminal convictions? I think this has real pertinence to those of us who are working on trafficking-related issues. Because one of the big things that I've found in the next project I'm going to describe, which is really the big project I've spent the last 2 years of my life working on, is that it is often the trafficking victims, especially when it comes to women and gender-based violence survivors, who came to appear in our database because they had some kind of criminal history, often tied to some kind of drug addiction, often, I would argue, tied to very clear histories of vulnerability, abuse, sexual trauma that began at a really early age. So I want to walk you through, for instance, the story of Gabriella, who's the girl you can see in the picture. She was brought to the U.S. as a child trafficking victim. It appears that she was sold by a family member to a man who brought her here for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation. She was then in a household where she was also facing sexual abuse. And Gabriella decided to tell authorities about this. The man was arrested and deported, and she was put in foster care. Gabriella had a lot of serious trauma issues that resulted in some serious behavioral issues as well. So while she was in the care of the state, she wound up having an episode where she lashed out at one of the workers and spat on them, which turns out to be a felony in Oklahoma. And she was 16 years old at the time. She was prosecuted as an adult because they argued that the crime was serious enough, and she got a felony on her record. I believe that she did not even fully comprehend exactly what she was doing when she pled guilty to this crime. I went to visit her in a prison in Oklahoma, which is when I found out the story of what happened to her after her deportation. So I'll get to how she wound up being in a prison in Oklahoma in a second. But what happened to Gabriella is that she got this on her record when she was 16. She was going to regular ICE check-ins thereafter, and on her 18th birthday, or a few days thereafter, she showed up at her regular ICE check-in, and she was surrounded by people, rounded up and deported. She was pregnant at that time, and because she was a trafficking victim as a child who had no real ties to El Salvador, which was the nation where she was born, she did not know what to do when she hit the ground in El Salvador, aside from go back to the family that had trafficked her. Those were the people that she knew. Those were the resources that she had. She went there, and she pretty quickly thereafter found out that the man who she had reported for sexual violence in Oklahoma, who had been deported, was now planning to come after her in a retaliatory way. So she decided she had to flee again. She was pregnant, she was terrified, she was by herself, but she made this journey north again. And this time, she was kidnapped by the Zetas. As I mentioned earlier, this extortion problem is pretty profound. I would say maybe even most of the people who I've spoken to who have made the journey have faced some kind of predation along the route. For Gabriella, it was essentially being held by the Zetas until she went into labor. Her father paid the ransom, and she was literally giving birth as they pushed her on the raft across into the Rio Grande Valley, and she was promptly locked up thereafter, which is where I came to interview her. I mean, I could go on with stories like this. I'll just quickly point to another one of a trafficking survivor, Yadira Fuentes Paz. She's an Army wife. She came from Honduras. Her husband is an Army staff sergeant at Fort Bragg. And she also was someone who developed an addiction after the years of sexual abuse. And she was deported for that addiction, I believe, in her early 20s. And because she had U.S. citizen children, she decided to make the journey back. and recently was pulled over for a minor traffic violation and is now facing deportation again. So she's seeking a T visa, and again, as I mentioned with the USCIS changes, it's entirely possible that if she does not receive one, she will be swiftly placed in removal proceedings. So I want to turn lastly to the current project that I'm working on and that I've spent the last 2 years on, which Meredith mentioned at the start with her thoughtful introduction, which is a project documenting what happens to people after their deportations. I would argue that's another side of the trafficking story that we often don't see. We know astonishingly little about what happens to people after they're deported. I really cannot overstate the case for that. So this project also actually began in the Obama era. So it began for me when so many of these debates were unfolding on Capitol Hill about the potential stakes of deportations and even the stakes of not finding a bipartisan pathway towards immigration reform. And so often I would hear this hypothetical invoked that many of you have probably heard too, which is we could be deporting people to their deaths. We could be deporting people to trafficking. We could be deporting women to gender-based violence. So for me, the journalistic alarm bells always go off whenever I hear this could be, would be, maybe this is happening. I decided what would it look like to really try to make an empirical case for that, to try to really understand what is happening at the ground level after people's deportations. And so I embarked on this search. Do we have lawyers in the room? Any lawyers, raise your hand? Okay. So I've always had this tremendous envy of law school clinics. And I decided what would it look like to try to turn the journalism classroom into a mini law school clinic. So again, as we did with the Trump tracker, we decided to divide up the country and also the region and reach out to more than 300 local legal aid organizations, organizations like the ones that many of you here today work at. You were invaluable resources to us. And we tried to find every case we possibly could of people who were deported to concrete kinds of harm. I want to walk you through a few of those categories really quickly, and then I want to transition to a few strategies and then to questions. But probably one of the biggest categories that we've seen and one of the biggest transitions in the Trump era is the direct rebuffing of people who came here seeking asylum, particularly from the Northern Triangle countries, including people who actually explicitly presented themselves at ports of entry. So people who didn't cross unauthorized, which, again, you would have the right to do if you were an asylum seeker and were trying to seek refuge. That is not a criminal act, but these are people who actually presented at ports of entries and were explicitly told in some cases, have you heard who's president now? I'm sorry, but there's no room for you here. People who were turned back. Oftentimes, those were people who were very vulnerable to trafficking. So a lot of the cases that we have in the database are people who were turned away at ports of entry or swiftly turned away at the border, not having been asked about their potential fears of harm, because we all know that due to the U.S. signatory of various international conventions and also due to domestic law, we have a policy of non-refoulement, so we do not return people if we have, or we're not supposed to return people if we know that they may face a very concrete harm if sent back. But nonetheless, what we were seeing is many, many people who were directly sent back at the border were then kidnapped and extorted by the Zetos when they got across to the other side. Deportees are very vulnerable directly across the border in Mexico. We also saw a pretty ubiquitous direct targeting of deportees in their home countries because they stood out like a sore thumb. Oftentimes, these were people who had spent a lot of time in the US, who were not really acquainted with their country of origin at that point, and those people were also really explicit targets for traffickers, extortionists, for gangs, for gang recruitment. I want to tell you quickly, this is the New Yorker piece that I ran in January on the preliminary stage of this database where we documented more than 70 cases of people who were deported to death or to other kinds of harm. I want to tell you a few of those stories and then tell you where we're taking this in its next chapter. One of the stories I focused on in the piece was the story of a woman named Laura. She was an example of the kind of woman I've talked about earlier in this speech, which is someone who had pretty deep roots in the US. She came to the US as a teenager. She had US citizen children. She was working at a restaurant in South Texas. And she had been in a very violent relationship with a man who was deported to Mexico for trying to kill her. And she was driving to work when she was pulled over by local law enforcement, who made an unusual decision for the time, but again, under SB 4, this would now be a routine and to some extent a mandatory process, which is that she was asked about her immigration status by the local cop, who actually later turned out was indicted because he had been collaborating with the Gulf Cartel and trafficking drugs back and forth and collaborating with them on other questionable deeds, which I don't get into in the piece. But he turned her over to immigration enforcement, and pretty precipitously, they brought her into the Weslaco Border Patrol processing station. This entire time, she was pleading and crying, saying, I have a very, very, very abusive spouse who was just sent back to Reynosa. He has threatened routinely to kill me. I have a protective order from a judge. Please give me a chance to just go show you this protective order. Give me a chance to go before a judge. She said this to the local cop. He ignored that, sent her over to immigration enforcement. She said this to immigration enforcement. They presented paperwork for her to sign and said, you have to sign this document. It turns out that it was a document authorizing her removal. She was taken to the bridge. That's actually this exact bridge shown in the picture of the New Yorker piece I wrote. She was walked back across the bridge that very same night. So it was actually before any law offices in the area had even opened for the morning. This happened, I think it was by that time around, well, I think it was around 2 in the morning when she was pulled over. It was at dawn when she was deported. Her last words to the Border Patrol agent who deported her were, when I am murdered next week, my blood will be on your hands. That's exactly what wound up happening to Laura. She was, in fact, immediately found by the man who had been threatening to kill her and was violently strangled and set on fire. So you can see that these threats are very real. I invite you, I hope this isn't too selfish of me, but one of the things that we are trying to do is to continue to document these stories so that we can put them together into a database that will be publicly searchable. We have not yet published that, so we're hoping to do so by January. And we want it to be something where you can search by region, by the reason someone fled, by the harm they faced when they were sent back. And we have uncovered a lot of patterns. I think I may have gotten to that on an earlier slide. So one of the patterns was domestic violence survivors like Laura. Another of the patterns was how precipitously people can be deported now and what that means in the context of a real lack of legal representation. As all of you know, people who are in removal proceedings are not entitled to legal representation, so a lot of these folks were deported without a lawyer. 2 of the cases we have in the database of people who were killed after their deportations were actually people who were accidentally deported. They had a judge who said, we need to stay on this removal until this person is given a chance to apply for asylum. Even in those cases, I think because we have churned the system so fast, we're seeing people deported to their death before they get a chance to go before a judge. But I'll be honest, we're also seeing plenty of people who are deported after they did get a chance to see a judge. What we're seeing under Sessions, as many of you know, and in the Matter of AB case in particular, is that there's been a real shifting of who constitutes a, quote, legitimate refugee or asylee. And one of the major changes that's happening of late is these guidances issued to folks who do the credible fear interviews and through USCIS to essentially say, people who fled gang violence, that may no longer be enough to get you asylum. People who fled domestic violence, that also may no longer constitute sufficient grounds for legal refuge here. So I think that has obviously really significant ramifications for people who fled gender-based violence. I could go on and on about other things we found in the database. As I mentioned, I'll share my email at the end because we are still collecting cases. So if you know of people who were deported and harmed after their deportations, those are things we would like to log, and we can make them anonymous where relevant. But I want to just quickly map a few of the ways I've thought about what it looks like to try to tell these stories at this particular moment in time. One of the big things I've noticed is that a lot of the data you want to exist just doesn't exist. And so I've started to embark on methodologies of, where the data isn't there, you have to make your own data. And many of you in this room may be in the position to actually try to figure out how you capture data of what's happening locally in your organization. We called hundreds and hundreds of local legal aid groups and domestic violence service providers and groups of that sort. And a lot of them, all they really had was the anecdotes of what they felt they were experiencing, what they were seeing on a daily basis. But it was really difficult to make that align with some of the numbers. So it was tremendously helpful to us, and I think tremendously helpful in the context of public discourse to be able to document things like the change in the number of calls you're seeing around domestic violence and how that may correlate to concerns and immigration enforcement anxieties in particular. I think it's also really important as a way of checking kind of the public statements and public rhetoric about what is ostensibly happening in immigration enforcement and the actual lived reality of it on the ground. Another thing that I think is really important and that I often try to think about as a journalist, and I know some of the other journalists in the room do incredibly well at these tables here today, is to think about how we challenge these really simplistic binaries that I think a lot of advocates have thought are their best chance of protections for a certain category of people. Binaries of the good immigrants versus the sketchy ones. And I think one of the classic ways we've seen that play out is in the DACA debate. There's been such pressure on young people to have to be like the perfect, upstanding, valedictorian, straight-A student in order to merit legal protection here. And I would argue that that set us up to make people like the young women I mentioned earlier, Gabriela, and the Honduran army wife who is now facing removal because of these prior convictions. Those people are kind of erased from the picture, and I think we've been really quick to throw them under the bus. So again, I think that has really serious consequences for trafficking survivors in particular, because as many of you know, these are populations that often are directly criminalized and who may show up under that. Even what Obama talked about as the felons, not families approach to immigration enforcement. Thinking about the roles of survivors' voices, I think so many people are saturated in the trauma stories right now. I have been tremendously moved by seeing all the ways that fear also does the inverse of all the bad stuff I'm talking about. Fear mobilizes communities. Fear mobilizes the kind of work that you've seen by people who are fighting to keep their DACA status. I think seeing how impacted parties have reckoned with this current moment. Another really moving thing I witnessed directly was going up to Maine and talking to domestic violence survivors who had been very, very fearful of reporting to law enforcement, even under Obama. I should actually mention, these were people who were not technically undocumented individuals. These were actually refugees. I was interviewing women in a community of Congolese and refugees and women from Angola. And a member of their community had recently been murdered. Ms. Kubaloso was fearful of reporting her partner's violence to law enforcement, even though she actually was technically here legally. I think that's super important to underscore that many people, they're not familiar with the US immigration context, and even though they have status, that may not be sufficient protection to make them feel comfortable. So there was a group in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine, called Hope House, where a lot of these women, after Ms. Kubaloso's murder, actually started doing direct organizing to figure out how to surface stories of domestic violence in their community. There was also a group of Somali women who were directly impacted who were doing organizing around how to make women feel safe to report the crimes that they were enduring on a daily basis. And then lastly, I always turn to Bruce Western, who I think is a brilliant sociologist. He's now here in New York, and he talks about two tools that he's seen be tremendously effective in telling the stories of people who are often hard to narrate. And number one, it's about showing the context for people's decision-making. So I know some people would think, for instance, that it's a form of excuse-making to say that the reason Gabriela spat on a guard was she has a long history of trauma and abuse that needs to be contextualized in the way that her case was adjudicated. But I think it's incredibly important to help people understand why someone like Gabriela, a trafficking survivor, might have done the things she did that led her to the place where she landed. And then secondly, showing people in acts of being creative and acts of being loving. I think we're so much in a context of saturated trauma and victimization right now that it's incredibly important to get outside of frameworks that singularly paint immigrants as victims and to look at the tremendous forms of resilience that we're seeing. Lastly, I will just chime in about trusting your instincts. One of the things that really intrigues me about the issues we're talking about today is that almost every time one of these issues has become a major news topic, a front-page news topic, it's something that advocates were directly seeing on the ground many months or even years before. This was true with the Godoy Boys case of the unaccompanied minors, so-called crisis in 2014. I had been hearing literally for probably 3 years about people who were working directly at the border who in 2011 and 2012 and 2013 were seeing a doubling and then a tripling of the number of unaccompanied minors who were coming. It just wasn't being covered in the news. Finally, in 2014, it exploded across the front pages, and then we all paid attention. And then I would also argue we need to tell the Act 2 story. So there's often these moments, these news blips. I think we're seeing that now with the family separation crisis. What happens in the second stage? That's when I think a lot of the media often drops off the job, and that's where your role as people who are directly on the ground seeing these things unfold can be tremendously helpful. I will say family separation is another example of where the experts knew it first. I mean, I was talking to people in January and hearing consistent story after story about people, even prior to the zero tolerance prosecutions, families who were coming here, kids who were being directly separated, often from grandparents or parents, directly under the rhetoric of human trafficking protections. These families were being told that, we need to make sure that this parent isn't a trafficker, which I should acknowledge can be a genuine concern in some contexts, but family separations were happening in that stage. And many of us, because the Trump administration said that this isn't a formal policy, this is only about protecting trafficking victims, we all ignored this, I must say, for a really long time in the period where they were doing their test cases prior to the zero tolerance prosecutions, when it exploded into a big national issue that continues to be huge today. So I'll just end with this word that I learned while along this journey with the Central American mothers searching for their kids who had disappeared. They taught me this word, desahogarse. Hopefully the Spanish speakers here can pronounce this better than I can. But I really loved this word, and I think it's a good, instructive one for all of us right now in this moment. It essentially means to undrown yourself. And one of the women used it in the context of what it meant for her to be on this trip, learning to directly narrate her own story. And for her, that was a form of unburdening herself. And I know that so many of you do this direct work of listening every day and what it means to give people a venue in which to undrown themselves and forums in which they can tell their stories. I'm tremendously grateful for those of you who are doing that really hard work. And I look forward to the panels of undrowning ourselves that are to come later today. So thank you so much for your thoughtful listening, and I would love to take your questions.
So I think that it would make a more powerful statement if you, and I know it may not be possible because the data's not there, if you were able to articulate the number of people, let's say out of the last 100 people who were deported, what percentage of them were okay versus had harm, but you also need to differentiate it in terms of how many of them only knew the United States versus how many of them had recently come from and had family still in that location. I think that would make a much more powerful statement than only focusing on the harm that's done to people.
Yeah, you know what? That would be a dream. And if any of you have methodological insights, I cannot tell you the number of hours that have been spent simply trying to find the cases. This is what is astounding to me about our lack of visibility about the post-deportation landscape. We're now embarking on a very similar project looking globally, so we're expanding this to include any country to which someone was deported. So we've got cases from Mauritania, from Somalia, all around the world. And what's really, really, really difficult is we have zero visibility. We can't even really profess to call this data in the most formal sense because I think we are barely even scratching the tiniest surface of that. And it's a really intractable problem that we don't have much methodological way around unless the US government or the home country governments want to come up with better methodologies for tracking people's fates post-deportation. I will say we do absolutely track the routes through which people were deported, and we've mapped about 5 or 6 of those, so we've kind of looked at them in a kind of longitudinal sense of the people who are directly deported after appearing at ports of entry seeking asylum, people who crossed over unauthorized and were turned back before they were asked the proper things that the law requires Border Patrol to ask about whether they fear harm if sent back, the people who crossed in and actually spent a long time in the country and had deep roots here who got to go before an immigration judge and were still sent back because they were deemed not falling under any of the protected categories. So we have been really systematic about mapping the different routes through which people have faced that harm, but it is really, really hard to get an accurate snapshot of how that looks proportionally. And I mean, I would absolutely love to do it, and if anyone is able to do it, I will bow to you. Thank you for that.
Yes. As a journalist, how do you deal with the vulnerabilities of these human beings, thinking that maybe telling their stories can augment the risk for themselves. I'm telling you because I'm also dealing with this situation. To what extent do you use real names? Do you share their pictures? I mean, how do you deal with that problem and conflict?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really, really huge issue. Everything from just the immense amount of trauma so many of these people have gone through before you interview them, to thinking about what are the potential consequences of having their names on the record in print. And I would argue, the obvious starting point is just thinking about a language of informed consent and what that looks like in the context of precarious immigration status. So making sure as a starting point that people really know and understand where their story will wind up. I mean, the Fijian women's example is a really interesting one because they really wanted their names on the record. They really wanted their stories out there. But they also were like, oh, the New Yorker, like, no one in Fiji knows what the hell that is and who cares? And then it turned out, like, because of Facebook now, like, this story was circulated all around Fiji. The local Fijian newspapers picked it up. And so I think this thing I thought of as a kind of loose form of protection for them really was not. And luckily they were okay with that, but I have to be honest that I didn't fully foresee that, and it has really changed how I think about the norms of informed consent, really being rigorous about the assumption that this could be seen by anyone and used by anyone in any context once it's out there in the public sphere. I think that's mandatory. And I think it's real now that there are times when we've seen direct targeting of people who've chosen to come forward with their stories by immigration enforcement. I think we've seen that of some activists in upstate New York who were really vocal in fighting their deportations after working on a dairy farm. I believe they were pulled over for minor traffic stops, and then when they were written about, there was some kind of question as to whether their vocal way of approaching their cases and their stories in the press had that impact on them. So I think one of the big things I really underscore for journalists is I cannot oversell enough the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. They have really, really concrete tools on their website. They might also be useful tools for service providers, but it's called the DART, the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. And they have really direct manuals for how to think about informed consent and trauma-sensitive interviewing practices and all the rest of that when it comes to in the refugee context, in the immigration context, in the sexual assault context. So I would say like that's a really useful place to begin for thinking about this. But I think the need to consider the prospect of anonymity now is real. Other questions?
I just had a comment going back to the first question, is that I think it's always there. I know, for instance, currently in Tijuana, 4 new call centers have just opened up that are hiring recent deportees who grew up in the U.S. and have the language skills. And I think some of that has been covered. There's also a university that does a lot of migration studies in Baja that covers a lot of these issues from the perspective of recent deportees that I think might be a source of information that I don't see covered in the U.S. media a lot. Yeah,
that's a great point. And there are certainly groups doing amazing work on the ground. I mean, I cannot tell you how awe-inspiring it was to see what's happening in some of these shelters, too. I mean, the risk at which many of the Catholic shelters are operating in context of real threat. I think that's really impressive work. And then, I mean, I think oftentimes the local press covers these things. They do it in a really sensational way much of the time. It's like the Nota Roja, like the kind of red notes where they put these violent murders. So we've seen a lot of clues where we can't actually get to the bottom of them, where we're combing local news sources in all of the different countries we're looking at. And so often all you see is like, here's a beheaded person in this town and a claim that they were a recent deportee. But not much more to go on than that. So, no, thank you. I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of good organizations working directly on the ground with deportees.